As ever, we have Dr. Richard Scott, GP. Hello, Richard.
Andy, good to be back.
So last week we were looking at Alzheimer's, a new test that's come out of Sweden, and just a really quick my version overview is it's a test that will probably tell you if you might have Alzheimer's in 10 to 15 years. And we were looking at, is this something we should do? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And we looked at the ethics. We looked at also, if you had the test and you were told you were going to have Alzheimer's, how might you react? And I thought it was one of the most gripping and interesting conversations we've ever had, if I'm honest.
Mm. It's a right business, because whilst we want medicine to move forwards, and tests for diseases sound good, they're only good really if you can then treat the disease, and that was one of the things we talked about, and especially when it's so devastating as Alzheimer's. Do we want to know if we can't treat it? So what we've done is this test came along, which it looks like it is. They're going to be there in the next couple of years. And alongside it, the treatment suddenly was so good, and hopefully not too expensive, because that's the other issue. If only a few people can have it, not many, then it becomes unfair. And how do you choose postcode lotteries? So it throws up a whole lot of tests, a whole lot of questions, really. And what sounds on the surface, that sounds great. Oh, we've got a test for Alzheimer's. When you actually put your thinking cap on, get your noddle working. For Americans, that's get your little grey cells working. Yeah, it may not be so good.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, though, isn't it? Because when we think, oh, great, we've got a test, we can know whether we got this or we got not this. Yes, but why and what? And then we really have to start to think, well, if I do have that, and I think one of the things you said was you were concerned about this sort of very specific set of depression. And one of our family conversations was great. So you have the test, and then you're probably going to get it. And then you start to forget because you're getting older. Oh, well, that's it. You got your Alzheimer's now. That's kicked in. So you're writing off such a large swathe of time that might have nothing to do with a diagnosis. At best, it's only highly probable.
Sure, indeed. I mean, the disease that comes to mind when we were always training, and I occasionally come across patients with this, is Huntington's disease. And that's a disease that comes on in early adulthood, and has great implications, because people actually they're living a little bit longer, usually used to die by 40. And therefore, and it's it's a dominant disease. So if you've got this disease, you need to know, because it affects whether you reproduce, because you've got a 50% chance of passing on to your children. And so that is a really important disease to test for, even if there is no cure at present. Clearly, researchers are trying to cure the disease, but that's different from Alzheimer's, which comes on later in life. It isn't something you can pass on to the next generation. So I have concerns. And whilst I see the other side, where it's, okay, if I'm 50 and I'm going to get it when I'm 70, well, I've got 20 years, to have the best time possible. Well, again, whilst I can understand that, you're still at the back of your mind every day thinking, goodness, when's it going to show? And all your relatives are thinking, when's it going to show? And as soon as you do something wrong, you forget something. Oh my goodness, it's happening. All this stuff that wouldn't be going through your mind if you didn't have the test done. And also, as Christians, what's God got planned for us? It isn't simply to go on holiday for the next 20 years, or to actually use our time better. Because I think if one's time is shorter, then the people I have admired most over the years, often who've died at a ripe old age, as Christians, people like Michael Green, for example, have spent their lives working really hard for God right to the end, not just going on holiday. So there's so many questions it brings up.
We had a few that came in. The first one, which I think we touched on, what research is happening to prevent or cure or understand Alzheimer's?
Oh, the stacks of research, which is now these two new drugs have come out. I mean, it's because it's such a crucial disease, with increasing number of people, especially as we live longer. There's an enormous amount of work going on. So this is not something that's, and again, that's where these blood tests have come from. People have done research and had to work really hard. Before you find a test for anything, think about the amount of work that went into COVID to rapidly find a test that could diagnose COVID, which we couldn't initially. Tests, and then try and find treatments that would help massively before would apply to other diseases, because it was so urgent. The urgency hasn't quite so much been there with Alzheimer's, but the importance has been there for 10, 20, 30 years. So there's loads of work going on. believe you me, that's thankfully out of that. We've got these new treatments, and we've got this new blood test. But the treatments only provide about 20% improvement. And so that's the concern, that the blood test, in a sense, is well ahead of the treatments. Would you want the test, knowing that actually the treatments aren't that great?
All right, another one. Why does it seem as though there are more cases of Alzheimer's? Is it because we have a better understanding? Is it life expectancy increasing, or is it something to do with modern living, or all or none of the above?
Well, the first two, definitely. I mean, there's more and more diagnosis, for example, of diabetes going on. Well, there's two reasons for that. Number one, more and more people are putting on weight and becoming diabetic. But number two, we've actually reduced the blood sugar level at which diabetes is diagnosed. It used to be sort of blood sugar of 8, then it was 7, now it's less than 7. So we're creating more diabetics instantly by shunting the blood level down. And 3, people are more aware. So all of those. I can't definitely say it's lifestyle, because we don't actually 100% know the cause of Alzheimer's. We know what we could find, which are these tau proteins and the amyloid that increases in the brain. The causes for these things aren't clear. All I would say is that in poorer countries, there seems to be much less Alzheimer's than in the West. And therefore, one would imagine lifestyle and diet plays a role. Plus, of course, we're living longer in the West, and it's a disease of old age, although a few unfortunate people can get Alzheimer's in their 50s. But for most people, it's coming on in the late 70s, 80s. So I think probably it's a function of living longer and something to do with lifestyle and diet, although we don't 100% know what yet.
Okay, one more. This I think came off your. We did one about different villages. There seems to be evidence of a village with no case of Alzheimer's, which I think we talked about. It seems to be because older people have been valued more and have more purpose. Do you think, therefore, there is something in this as a way to prevent or reduce cases of Alzheimer's?
Undoubtedly, it's been shown, and not necessarily specifically for Alzheimer's, but for dementia in general, that if we keep our brains active, and that's what's happening in these villages, old people carrying on volunteering, physically keeping active, mentally keeping active, and in one of the examples I gave you, spiritually keeping active. This makes a big difference. So, what can we do to reduce dementia generally? Well, certainly stop smoking. Smoking is terrible for microvascular dementia. That's an easy one. Keep drink down to reasonable levels, not too much drink. Try and keep as fit and well as possible. But also keep our brains active. So I've got a friend, for example, who does these terribly difficult crosswords in the Times that I can't possibly attempt. I quite like where they have these polygons with 7, 8, or 9 letters, and you've got to work out one word using all the letters. That's what I do. But I also I like to think about some of the stuff I've watched on telly, in particular sport. Who scored this goal? Who did that? How did it go? Who passed to him? That's my own individual interest. What I'm doing, I've given myself a bit of brain work. Of course, still working as a doctor, I'm having to think each day. But when I retire, it's very important, keep reading, keep thinking, go to conferences, keep active mentally. And that's certainly something we can do, as well as keeping physically well, to keep dementia at bay.
This is for me. Maybe this is completely anecdotal, but I always think of, I knew lots of teachers as I was growing up, and you'd notice a teacher had got to the holidays and you knew they were on holiday, nothing to do with children. They were ill within 2 days. And yes. I always thought, well, is this because you're so exhausted? Now you've stopped, your body's gone, okay, finally I can actually have the illness now. I mean, is that in any way tied to this?
Well, I'm not so much tied to this, but what it's tied to is adrenaline, which keeps many teachers going, especially at the longest term, which is the September and December term. It keeps them going. And when finally they can put their feet up and they just relax, the adrenaline goes, and it's somehow kept viruses, etc., at bay, and then they just collapse. So somehow I'm just trying to think, if I was in their situation, I would need to sort of wind it down slowly rather than just stop dead. Because if I knew that was the case and 2 days later I was going to be ill, let's think about this. I don't want to be ill in 2 days. Perhaps teachers would say, well, it's easy for you to say you haven't done it. And I would hold my hands up and say that's fair. But you're absolutely right. And I see this all the time with teachers. In fact, my wife's sister is a teacher. And so it's such a common thing. It's rough, isn't it? They bust their gut during the term and they get ill in the holidays. So I think teachers would need to think, to be some research on this. How can we keep well when we're not at the cold face, so to speak?
That's a topic for another day. Right, this has got
Topic for
nothing to do with
another
that. Yeah, this next one's got nothing to do with Alzheimer's. It comes from my wife, Jojo. We
day.
were talking about splinters on Family Focus, which is our Sunday afternoon show. Andy
Mm.
B's low point. Now, his top tip is to use magnesium sulfate paste.
Ah,
Can Dr. Scott explain how this works and whether this is the right way to go for splinters or anything else?
it's a good point about splinters. Well, magnesium sulfate is a classic where when you've got a boil that hasn't yet come to a head, what we used to do, old treatment, was to put magnesium sulfate on it, which draws it to the surface so it can be quickly nicked and you deal with the problem quicker rather than waiting for it to, for 2 or 3 days to get to the surface. So it has a role in seems to draw fluid into itself and literally help to speed up the treatment of the problem. Now, logically, whether it would help a splinter to come to the surface, I have to say I haven't actually heard that. And what I do with splinters is just grit my teeth and get my wife to use a needle and dig it out. um, whether magnesium sulfate paste would work, well, if it's surrounded by a bit of fluid, which it often is, then yeah, there probably would be some logic in that. You'd still have to make a little nick and pull the blighter out, but it's easier if it's nearer the surface. So yeah, logically that might well work, but I haven't tried it.
Yeah, that one comes from a pharmacist going back about a decade, whose I think husband or father was a woodworker, always having splinters, didn't want to be constantly, hacking at his fingers. And she said, try it. So I don't have splinters often, but I had one and it's a trick I've used. And what I found is it does come to the surface. And once or twice with the plaster, it's actually just come out on its own. I've gone and thought, where is it? And it's in the plaster.
Well, Andy, you've taught me something. And so, whilst I'm not necessarily going to follow my own advice on cold dips, I think the magnesium sulfate trick, because presumably we can still get this from chemists, because
Yes.
I say it's an old medicine, but I'm presuming it's still there. Yeah, well, thank you, because I get splinters from time to time doing some stuff in the garden. Roses, if I was a rose, I'd stick a thorn in someone, and roses seem to do that to me all the time. You come back and think, oh, I've got another one. So thank you, magnesium sulfate. Top tip from the listeners.
Yes. Well, I went to a pharmacy recently. The only thing I remember her saying was when it runs out of date, when it expires, it becomes completely ineffective. It won't harm you, it just doesn't do anything. So give it a really good stir and put as much as you can physically get on under a plaster, which is what I do.
Top tip.
There you are. You see, Alzheimer's and splinters in one episode.
That's
right.
what people listen in.
Oh, do you know? I think so. Where's Andy B going to go next? Have we got next week's topic thought? Do you know what we're doing next time? It's 2 weeks' time, but
we do. We're going to talk about fasting and how fasting is good for us. Now, again, this is something actually that, funny, of my wife has been leaning on me recently, and I'll tell you why. Because in her church, not in her church, in my middle daughter's church, where Heather was supporting her with her new baby in January, the minister there had said to people, I think we ought to go on a fast. Big church, 200 plus people. And his fast was quite unusual. He drank milk only for 3 weeks. That's it. In fact, he even came to the dedication of this baby. There's cake, sandwiches all around. Just a glass of milk, please. And I thought, well, that's quite something. That takes quite a lot of courage to do that. And he's very much close to God, and he's leading the church very well. But fasting, what I'm looking at is not so much changing the diet, but actually having time off. And how many hours makes a difference, and what's the science behind it? So yeah, next one actually in 2 weeks' time is fasting and the benefits thereof.
I'm looking forward to that one. I've done a week fast twice where I just drank water. I don't like fasting, but what we found actually was we would often, Joe and I, do a 2/3 of a day fast, so breakfast and lunch, because our boys wanted to have dinner with us. So we'd fast breakfast and lunch and pray instead of those 2 times. And then but the evening meal, we'd have an evening meal with our boys.
Well, I mean, and that's very sensible. And I'm sure from what I know already about fasting, that's what's recommended, having a sort of 14-hour gap or something between meals. So I shall look at it and have a bit more information to come your way. But I'm pretty sure that ties in with this 14-hour gap that is recommended in fasting.
There you go. Well, if you've got any questions or thoughts about today, Alzheimer's and splinters, and you've got any thoughts about fasting, it'll be a couple of weeks' time. You can email those questions to us here. hello@pure247radio.org. hello@pure247radio.org. And I'll put your questions to Richard. And if you've got any hot topics in the news, you're thinking, what's the real truth about this? What's this really about? You can send those as well, preferably with an article, would be really helpful, the web link, and I can send them on to Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. No, actually, I'd just like to add to that. Please do, because we've got this next topic of fasting, and I may or may not come across something in the paper or on my feeds. But but I'd love to know what you want to hear. We want to scratch where you itch. So tell us where you itch, and we'll get scratching.
That sounds like another need for some cream, but not magnesium sulfate. Thank you, Richard.
Andy, very good to speak as ever.